Welcome to Hub Dialogues. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at the Hub. I'm honored to be back in conversation with David Frum for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll discuss a recent announcement by Concordia University in Montreal that it intends to decolonize its curriculum, pedagogy, and overall institutional culture, and what this announcement tells us about broader trends in North American universities, the culture, and our understanding of history. David, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you.
Concordia's decolonization plans are set out in a multi-year strategy for the university. It defines decolonization as, quote, a necessary and ongoing process of unlearning, uncovering, and transforming legacies of colonialism, as well as utilizing the educational and knowledge systems available to relearn and rebuild the social, cultural, and linguistic foundations that were lost or eroded through colonialism, unquote, and commits to, quote, critically evaluating and decentering Eurocentric knowledge systems and reconceptualizing curriculum in ways that center, weave, and privilege Indigenous ways of knowing, lived experiences, histories, and perspectives, unquote. David, I won't ask you to decipher all of that. Instead, let's just start with your big picture reaction. Why do you think this type of announcement is significant? What does it tell us about universities and the broader culture?
If this announcement meant that Concordia University was going to invest more effort in teaching non-Western languages, in studying more closely Latin American history and the history of other societies, doing more work on geography in Africa, if what they were talking about was additive to human knowledge, then yeah, more knowledge is good. The rest of the world is growing faster than Europe and North America. And obviously, these parts of the world need to be integrated into knowledge. But that's not what they want to do. They don't want to. What they are talking about is actually not adding to knowledge, but anti-knowledge. And the stinger in the tail is when they talk about elevating Indigenous ways of knowledge. And the reason this is such a stinger, supposing Concordia announced that what they were going to do was convert their curriculum to upholding the truth and beauty of the Roman Catholic religion, that every attendee at Concordia would be instructed in the Roman Catholic religion and they would be graded on their commitment to its doctrines. People say, are you crazy? You can't teach religion at a Canadian institution like from inside. Like that's, well, the central fact about Indigenous ways of knowledge, the central fact about all non-Western ways of knowledge is they're religious. That is, and if you don't know that about them, you don't know anything about them. The whole idea that knowledge can be separated from faith is itself the first and most important contribution to Western civilization. If you're going to reject Western ways of knowing, what you really have to do, if you're going to be serious about it, is reject the concept of secularity, because many of these systems have things that they claim to know that obviously are not true. Traditional Indian medicine with its system of teaching about the systems of the body and the different food groups, it's not true. The myths and legends that the Aboriginal people of North America tell about their origins, they're not true. You go through claim after claim, they're not true. The only way that these claims are defensible is they are religious doctrines. And so we don't tend to challenge them in a Western society because we have this rule. Well, we don't, it's bad form. I mean, it would be very bad form, even if you're not a Catholic, to say, I'm not a Catholic, I happen not to agree with it, but you don't offensively say that the claims are not true because the proponents don't claim that these are universally true. That's the price of living in a secular, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-faith society. But if Concordia is serious about doing anything other than, just hiring some decorative people to fill out a quota, if they're serious about this project, what they're doing is talking about making their institution a religious institution that is going to teach things that are not true as true in order to, and defend the non-true claims by saying, well, this is our religious faith here at Concordia.
Yeah, well said. I would just say in parentheses, your observation about it being subtracting rather than adding to human knowledge is reflected in the first word of the document I cited at the beginning, which is unlearn. And it seems to me that notion of unlearning runs through a lot of these ideas that increasingly are finding resonance and salience on different university campuses across North America, which leads me, David, to my second question, because it must be said that Concordia, in its defense, is hardly an outlier on some of these issues, which begs the bigger question: what is going on university campuses these days, David? How have these fringe ideas come to loom so large?
Yeah. I think a cynical thing that is going on in university campuses is universities have said, look, our core mission is science and technology. That's where our social prestige comes from. That's where the money comes from. That's what most people want to study. But we also recognize that there are these destructive elements on university campuses. So what we're essentially going to do is make a deal with them. We will surrender the humanities departments, which are withering anyway, and let them do with them what they will. And there may be some infiltration to some of the social sciences. We'll concede sociology and not economics. That's important, but we will. It's a partition deal with their offerings. We take science, we take STEM plus economics. You get the rest. You leave us in peace. We'll leave you in peace. That, I think, is basically what is going on. The problem is, as with all systems of appeasement, it doesn't work, because implicit in the concession is, it's actually kind of insulting, which is you can destroy the history department or the English department, because in the end, the president of the university doesn't think they're very important. Just stay away from chemistry, economics, and medicine. Now, the people to whom you make that proposition say, well, they are zealots. They believe in what they're doing. They're not going to let you keep economics and engineering and medicine uncontaminated. They're going to want the whole thing, because implicit in the partition is a criticism, and that is what. So there's going to be a struggle, and I think the university ends up being either rediscovering its commitment to truth, rediscovering its commitment to the separation of faith from knowledge, rediscovering its commitment to secularism and non-sectarianism, or it's going to end up surrendering more and more and more of the ground.
That's a brilliant analysis, David. For a long time, I thought these ideas were counterproductive and dumb, but ultimately harmless. I've started to doubt that assumption in recent months. The demonstration and protests that we've seen on campuses and in Canada's major cities, effectively in support of Hamas, are a sign that the ideology of decolonization and oppressed versus oppressor are having real-world consequences. Talk about that for a minute.
Well, it is dumb because it destroys the knowledge of the very thing it claims to promote. If you're studying the history of India, who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed? Well, the answer is that, look, empires come, empires go. There are Muslim invasions at various times. There are Turkish invasions. There are Afghan invasions. Then there are counter moves by more indigenous faith traditions. But we're not going to be able to get very far in any real way of studying India if we insist on saying either the Muslims are invaders and colonizers and the Hindus are oppressed, or conversely, that in modern India, it just doesn't work. You end up not knowing very much about India, just the ideology. You end up taking an ideological system and applying it. In the same way, if you're going to study the history of the Middle East, the Ottoman world, who's the oppressor and who's the oppressed? How do you think? It's a system that is designed to apply only to one case in human history. And since it only applies to that one case, everyone ends up studying that single case. And all kinds of things that are important to know end up not being studied because you can't cram them into the ideology. And so history is the domain where I know best, but it also ends up affecting everything else. And like, if you're going to teach literature or art, there's an infinite number of works of art. There's an infinite number of texts to study. Universities used to be confident that they could tell you these are the ones that are important to study, and these are the ones that you can read on your own, or that are best left to the dust of oblivion. If they lose that faith, what's the point of them? If everything is a text, and any way of reading a text is as good as any other one, well, then why do we have literature departments at all? Why do we have people employed to teach literature? What are you doing here that's useful? So it self-cannibalizes. It both forces knowledge out of the picture. And as I said, I think a lot of this just begins, which is I think very much at Concordia, you have a bunch of people who would like to teach who would, by normal standards of qualification, not be hired to teach. And so you have to invent a rationalization for giving them the teaching jobs that they otherwise wouldn't qualify. But you, as I said, with the other concessions, you cannot, the days in which that could be confined or hemmed in, well, we have, these one or two jobs that we fill as best we can for reasons that are political, but most of the university escapes. Obviously, that's not true anymore. The rest of the university does not escape.
In the US, where you are, David, a lot of universities rely on private funding. In Canada, virtually all universities are still largely dependent on public funding. How should Canadian governments respond to these intellectual trends? Should they use their financial levers to intervene? And if so, how do you avoid a scenario where politicians are effectively deciding what should be researched and taught on university campuses?
There's an interesting theoretical argument here, but as a practical argument, as we've discussed before, politicians won't do it. They can't. They don't know enough. They don't care enough. They're not present enough. And you get situations like the one that Governor DeSantis bumped into in Florida, where you, in attempting to minutely govern what is ungovernable, you write rules of increasing specificity that end up leading to absurd results and are intent. So you write something, you write a rule, and the people who don't like the rule say, right, okay, the first book banned under this rule is the Diary of Anne Frank. And the second book banned under the rule is the dictionary, because we can do that. The rule is, and then you say, well, let's rewrite the rule so it doesn't, and then something else, because in the end, you cannot make a university comply, and you shouldn't try to. I mean, people either believe in truth, they either believe in secular knowledge, they either believe that religion should be separated from science, or they don't. And if they don't, what's just going to end up happening is actually intellectual life is going to migrate away from universities, which is something I mean, look, if we were in North America in 1920, and we wanted to know where were the interesting people, the best scholars, you wouldn't look for them at a university. That's just not where the universities didn't hire people like that. That's not what universities were for. They would be somewhere else. And I think that is happening. One last story. A little while ago, I met a very distinguished former scientist who had had an academic background and then had worked for these government-based research institutions in an area of science. And he was now working in a for-profit environment. And he had hired, he told me, over the past couple of years, 400 scientists to work in a particular field.
Wow.
And all of them had left universities. And so I said, did you offer them stock? Did you double their salaries? How did you get them away? He said, no. He said, I offered them no paperwork. I don't pay them a dime more than they were making at the university, but I do it in an environment where it's fun to be. That's what's going to happen is that there are going to be people who are in universities and they will say, okay, this is miserable, but I don't have options, so I stick it out. But the people who have options will say, I'll go somewhere else that isn't miserable. And I'll go, and everyone in a university is making a kind of economic sacrifice to do something. Well, not everyone, but the people who should be there are making an economic sacrifice to do something I think is important. Well, if they can't do it, why will they make that economic sacrifice? And the universities will then fill up. I just did this this exercise the other day. I was thinking about a particular, I won't use names, but a particular American university that had been in the news. And I went, so as you see, I own, as you do, a lot of books, thousands of them. And probably 2/3 of them in the domain of history, and probably the majority of the 2/3 published by living authors. So I went to the faculty page with, do I own any books by any of the people in this large faculty? And so I get up to K and I find one, and then I skip ahead to N and I find another. But I realize that they've got like 4 dozen academics who are supposedly at the top of their field. And I think, am I making a mistake? And I look through the pub. No, not missing anything. Not missing anything. So, it catches up with you. People notice that you're not doing a good job. And and Canadian universities are insulated because, again, they're not in that kind of marketplace, and they're much bigger, and they're They're much more geographically based. Students choose them on the basis of where they're located, not because of the particularities of the university. But Concordia, if it takes this project seriously, is going to end up doing a lot of damage to its reputation for whatever that. They may not care about that, and maybe there are people who benefit from the university being less distinguished, but the university overall, the graduates suffer.
David, I know a lot of university professors and administrators, including some presidents, regularly listen to the Hub's podcasts. It feels like we're facing something of a moment of reckoning in the aftermath of Claudine Gay's testimony and subsequent resignation. What should they be doing to protect themselves, their institutions, and ultimately their social license to continue to receive funding and operate in Canadian society?
I was very struck reading the Claudine Gay story that one of the people she plagiarized was her own dissertation advisor. Now, that leads to me a couple of conclusions. There are a couple of possible explanations. One is he didn't read her dissertation before he graded it, which is one set of alarm. Second is he didn't read his own work, that graduate students wrote it for him and he didn't know what was in it, which is another kind of alarming. Mm-hmm. The third possibility is that he read the dissertation, noticed the plagiarism, and decided not to react because a lot of people at many steps along the way had incentives to overlook what was clearly someone who shouldn't be in academic life. Her dissertation is available online. That's why it's checked. She started her career when she won a prize at Stanford for the best undergraduate paper in political science that year. It's private property because undergraduate theses are properly not published. But I venture, if one looked at it, it would be full of plagiarism too. And I would venture that the person who graded it probably had a pretty good idea that that was true. Yes. So when people say, what do we do about this problem we have? We say, well, you know, you're not looking for me to rescue you from a problem not of your own making. You don't need my advice. You have consciously chosen this path. So don't ask me what you should do about it. Ask yourself, why am I doing it? And as I arrive at a destination where my institution is increasingly discredited, where my whole project is increasingly discredited, I need to ask myself some hard questions about why did we do this to ourselves? How have we lost our faith in the mission that there is truth, there is dogma, there is fact, there is untruth, there is religion, there is science. These are different, and we are in the truth business. And in the realm of the humanities, that there is things that are more important to know, things that are less important to know, works of art that are greater, works of art that are lesser. If we don't believe those things, just close the place and turn it into, a very fancy hotel or something.
At the same time, David, it seems to me wrong for conservatives to abandon universities. They remain major culture shaping institutions and are still by and large responsible for cultivating our social elites. How, therefore, should conservatives respond to these developments? Is there a way to actually seize on the moment to carry out sensible reform and renewal?
There's a classic work of political science that says that every institution offers unhappy participants two remedies. One is voice and the other is exit. And I think I would agree with you that conservatives shouldn't give up on the project of having voice, but their voice is only going to be credible to the extent that there's exit. And what exit is going to mean is that the STEM project that the universities care about needs to begin to migrate away from them, as is happening. That's the thing that is really going to panic universities. If big science ceases to be, with all of its money, ceases to be a project that is university-based. And I think building other kinds of institutions, conservatives have a problem with this because conservatives these days seem to value dogma of their own rather than real teaching. Not every critique of everything that was thought in 1970 is wrong. And if you can't take those critiques on board in an intellectually rigorous way, then how are you better than the people you're mad at? But the possibility of exit is what is going to sharpen the edge of voice. I was recently in a situation where I got a kind of tentative invitation to take part in a dialogue about how to reform a particular place. And I decided I didn't want to do it because I realized we're still at the stage where the Soviet authorities are inviting the economists at Novosibirsk to try to say, is there a way to incorporate some price signals within central planning? say, you know what, this isn't going to work. We need to begin by saying, we need you to agree the central planning system has failed, and then we'll talk about how do we move to a price system. But we need the universities to begin by saying, you know what, there are things worth reading that are more worth reading, things that are less. The professors know more than the students. The Western idea that faith is to be separated from knowledge that's at the core. We can't, if we center indigenous ways of knowing, we destroy the profoundly non-indigenous institution that is the Western university. And we're just going to face that. We're just going to face, we've got a Western cultural heritage that now can embrace the whole world. And we now want to teach in the way that we've inherited from the past, other kinds of subjects, and discover other kinds of writers, and discover other kinds of histories and other kinds of geographies, and integrate that. But, using our way of knowing, because we believe in it.
On the subject of controversial topics, you have a major new long-form essay out defending former U.S. President Woodrow Wilson from cancel culture. I won't ask you to lay out all of your arguments here. Listeners and viewers should go read the essay. But what did you learn in researching and writing it that applies to our conversation today?
So it is about to come out in the Atlantic, probably a day or two after you and I speak. It is, I must caution people, quite long, and I spent a lot of time on it. There are a lot of individual stories about Wilson that are false, and one or two of them I debunk. But look, the main thing I would want people to know is it's not good enough to say, well, people in the past were different. You have to understand how things in the past were arranged differently. So I'm especially concerned about the attacks on Woodrow Wilson, not from the left, but from, which are the usual thing, but from the right, because Wilson inaugurated a project of state building in the United States, of making the federal government more effective, making the United States more active in the world. He also had some bigoted ideas. And he also was, by the way, and I agree with this, generally an unpleasant person. I'm not an admirer of him as a human being. And so I think there are people on the right who have said, aha, if we can use these points where he deviates from modern ideas about what is fair and right as weapons to destroy the project of having a central bank, relying on the income tax rather than on tariffs, having America be active in the world, believing in alliances. These legacies of Woodrow Wilson, we will use objections that people who would defend these projects can't. These are we've leveled the biggest. We've pounded the heaviest boulders to drop on his head. They can't defend him against these boulders, and then we can take. And there's a very dramatic example of this. There's an opinion by Justice Neil Gorsuch that came out a year or two ago that is very devastating to the EPA's attempt to regulate greenhouse gases. And in the middle of this, and beneath this opinion, is a footnote in which there's a lengthy personal attack on Woodrow Wilson. You're like, well, what's this doing here? And by the way, it also goes to, speaking of Claudine Gay, the footnote is totally slapdash. It obviously was many of the, I track each quotation that he uses, and they're taken out of context. Some of them mean the reverse of what he claimed to mean. Obviously what happened was he sent a law clerk to do this. They trolled the internet, pulled off something that was probably pretty prefab, and stuck it into a Supreme Court opinion, which is not quite Claudine Gay level of bad, but bad. But his point was, if I can show you that Woodrow Wilson said things that liberals don't like, therefore I silence you when I say, therefore we cannot regulate greenhouse gases as a pollutant. You need to say, you know what? That's the fact that people on the left are defenseless against the move doesn't make it a good move. And they shouldn't be so defenseless. But also it's still a bad move because the federal government needs to regulate greenhouse gases as a pollutant.
David, I enjoy talking to you every 2 weeks, but today's conversation was particularly insightful. I want to thank you for joining me and look forward to catching up in a couple of weeks.